Hey, 42 here. It was a steady July afternoon like any other in Montreal, Canada in 1940. Over in Europe, a brutal war ravaged the souls of men, and howitzers howled as they rained bloody fire and suffering across the battlefields of Western Europe. But in Montreal, rail operatives spoke softly and walked calmly through the grand corridors of Bonaventure Station, as they did every morning. Trains arrived one by one, and one by one their various goods and passengers were offloaded with the same reverence as always. But on this particular day, there were 3 men of great importance in the station. Not that anyone there would have noticed, for that was intentional. One was Alexander Craig, a representative of the Bank of England, arriving on a train, and the others, David Mansour and Sidney Perkins, were from the Bank of Canada and were pensively awaiting Craig's arrival. They knew exactly why they had been sent, and Craig knew exactly why he was going there. But those 3 men were alone in that knowledge. The hundreds of other passengers and rail workers were none the wiser. Only years later would it become clear. As Alexander Craig stepped off the train, he greeted Mansour and Perkins with the most peculiar remark. "Hope you won't mind our dropping in unexpectedly like this, but we've brought along quite a large shipment of fish," putting strange and rather loud emphasis on the word fish. And he wasn't joking. Aboard the train were 2,729 boxes of fish. And it was of utmost importance that this fish was treated with extreme care and diligence, because the very future of the free world, the very future of humanity, relied on it. If that all sounds a little ridiculous, you might soon change your mind when I tell you that the fish on board the train that day wasn't fish at all, but hundreds of millions of pounds of gold and government securities. Because this is the story of Operation Fish, the biggest and most secretive movement of wealth in all of history. It was so outlandish and yet so perfectly executed that you really won't believe it happened. This is the story of how the British Empire moved its entire fortune across the Atlantic during World War II, disguised as fish. Now you can take part in your own Operation Fish in Fishing Clash. But unlike during World War II, these fish are completely real, and some are a real challenge to catch. Just imagine defeating a boss fish so big your entire clan celebrates your catch. Well, I've personally had a few moments like that thanks to today's sponsor, Fishing Clash, and it's a real blast. What I love most about Fishing Clash is the competitiveness. It has leaderboards to master, clan wars to dominate, or you can just take down the toughest fish and become a boss slayer. Fishing Clash is such a breeze to pick up and play for any kind of gamer. There's a range of events to get stuck into, character progression and exciting locations, with more than 50 unique fisheries. You can catch hundreds of species of fish from every corner of the globe. Join over 50 million players already casting their way to glory. Download the game by using my link in the description box, or scan the QR code you see on the screen now, and use my special gift code 42 to claim a special $20 value reward, including a unique avatar for free. It's fair to say that by 1940, the war wasn't going well for the Allies. Nazi Germany had blitzed its way through Western Europe with terrifying speed. France, Belgium, and the Netherlands had all fallen. The mighty British Empire stood, isolated, facing the very real possibility of a ground invasion by Hitler's unstoppable war machine. In this desperate hour, the people of Great Britain were focused on safeguarding themselves and their families. But those at the highest rungs of government were more concerned with safeguarding the vast wealth of Britain and her empire, because losing that meant losing the war for sure. No questions asked. Britain's gold reserves, government bonds and securities were quite literally the lifeblood of its wartime economy. Without them, the empire could neither buy weapons nor pay its armies. Today, government bonds and securities exist digitally on a computer system, but back then they were physical slips of paper. some of which were more valuable than a solid gold bar. And the big concern was that Hitler could swim across the channel, storm London's gold vaults, and steal almost all of that wealth. Indeed, this money was Britain's Achilles heel. And if you hadn't noticed, the Nazis were quite fond of stealing gold. They had already hoovered up the contents of the central banks of Poland, Austria, Belgium, the Netherlands, and would later steal all the gold of their supposed ally, Italy. Winston Churchill took office in May 1940, and one of his very first acts as Prime Minister was to accelerate the evacuation of Britain's wealth. I say accelerate because the War Office had already been moving the nation's wealth piecemeal out of the country for a couple of years. Where to, you may ask? Canada. It was the perfect choice. Canada was, at the time, part of the British Empire, and being so far away from the main theatre of conflict, it hadn't received any direct attack or aggression during the war. And it never did. As a quick interesting aside, Churchill drew up plans to relocate the entire British government to Montreal in Canada and continue fighting the war effort from afar should the Nazis ever manage a successful ground invasion. As I said, the Bank of England had been sending little bits of wealth over there since 1938. Obviously, all of these movements had to be kept top secret, but one of the cleverest such movements was in May 1939. Hitler's U-boats were patrolling the Atlantic corridor, and so sending random ships carrying a crap ton of gold from England to Canada was incredibly risky. It could have easily been sunk or stolen. But it just so happened that King George VI already had a royal tour to Canada planned in May, and so it was the perfect cover. 2 British warships, HMS Southampton and HMS Glasgow, escorting the King and Queen, secretly carried £14 million in gold in their holds, worth well over £650 million today. And since 2 warships were perfectly adequate and normal to escort royalty, nobody ever suspected the massive amount of wealth on board. A few months later, in October, a convoy of 5 ships, spearheaded by the light cruiser HMS Emerald, were loaded with £2 million of gold each in Plymouth and sent off to Halifax, Canada. Just bear in mind the stakes here. The loss of even one gold ship could seriously dent Britain's chances at winning the war. And it's not like history was on their side. In World War I, SS Laurentic was carrying 43 tons of gold to Canada when it sank after hitting 2 German mines just off the coast of Ireland. But this time they had a plan that even Dutch van der Linde would be proud of. The crew of the HMS Emerald convoy were given tropical white uniforms to wear, so if any German spies happened to be hanging around Plymouth Harbour, which they most probably were, it would look like the ship was heading somewhere really bloody hot, like Tahiti, instead of nuts shriveling Nova Scotia. But not all plans go to plan. The convoy was absolutely battered, not by the Nazis, but by brutal storms en route. They lost lifeboats, depth charges, and even a spotter plane overboard. But alas, they eventually landed in Halifax, and what they did not lose was a single bar of gold. Over the following months, the Emerald made a few more runs between Britain and Canada to ferry small increments of gold to safety. Britain got so good at it that other countries started sending their gold to London, so Britain could move it to Canada on their behalf. Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands all squirreled away huge amounts of their wealth through Britain in this manner. So far, Britain had kept these activities tightly under wraps. It was only after the war, in fact, that anyone other than those who were told knew anything of these covert gold runs. And so, when Churchill took command of the war efforts in 1940, he decided it was about time they scale things up. Despite their efforts, Britain still had the majority of its gold in London, where it was far too vulnerable for his liking. So, he conceived Operation Fish. The first, and rather controversial step, was to secure the wealth of the people of Great Britain, whether they liked it or not. He utilised the Emergency Powers Act, which is basically a law created to allow the government to do whatever the bloody hell it fancies during a war or catastrophic event. to confiscate bonds and stock certificates from everyone in the country, with the promise of returning them after the war. People were told that their money was being put away into safekeeping, but what they were not told was that it would soon be packed up into crates and sent on a perilous journey across the Atlantic to be stored in a Canadian vault. That's if it didn't sink along the way. Sure, it was dishonest, but you have to realise that had Churchill have told the British public where their money was really going, then the word would definitely get back to the Nazis, and before you know it, Hitler would be strapping on his skis and bashing down the doors of a random Canadian bank. Or much more likely, he would have just instructed his U-boats to heavily patrol this particular trade corridor to annihilate every one of the gold ships. So, secrecy was paramount. Now, with almost all of the private and public wealth of the empire secured under government control, it was time to properly set Operation Fish into action. And to move this much gold, hundreds of tons of the stuff, plus mountains of paper money, some special measures had to be put in place. Firstly, the weight limits that capped the amount that could be carried on a single voyage were completely scrapped. Now, if it fit on the boat, it could sail. But most importantly, nobody, apart from a very small and very select circle of people, could know what was happening and what cargo was being transported. It turns out it's really tricky to pack gold and money into wooden crates and then load them onto a ship without anyone noticing. The loading of ships in ports such as Plymouth and Liverpool were very conspicuous affairs that would take hours to complete. Anyone walking past would be able to see that a large shipment was being lowered onto a naval ship, and all it would take for the secret to get out would be for the wrong person asking a dock worker what it is exactly he was loading. Therefore, everyone was told, from the dock workers, known as stevedores, to the sailors and the ship's captain, that they were transporting crates of fish. And those in the know would be very careful to only ever refer to this precious cargo as fish, even when speaking with others within the secret circle, because you never know who is listening. And that's why Operation Fish was named so. And it seemed to be working. After all, people who lived around port towns were used to fish coming in and out on boats every day, so there was never any reason to be suspicious. And so, in June 1940, the first proper vessel to sail under Operation Fish left for Canada. HMS Revenge was carrying £40 million worth of gold and securities, worth over £2 billion today. She was escorted by two Canadian passenger liners, SS Antonia and SS Duchess of Richmond, each stuffed with £10 million of their own. Only days after that, HMS Furious was dispatched with yet another £20 million of goods. Since the weight limits of each vessel had now been completely ignored, the heavy gold bars and coins often caused permanent structural damage to the ships. Do you remember HMS Emerald that carried the King and Queen the year before, along with a secret stash of gold? Well, as part of Operation Fish, she was painstakingly stripped and refitted to carry as much cargo as possible. And then, on the 24th of June 1940, she slipped silently into the Atlantic from the out-of-the-way port of Greenock, Scotland, carrying a truly unprecedented amount of wealth, £30 million of gold and £200 million in stock certificates and bonds. There was so much gold and paper money on board that every nook and cranny on the vessel had to be utilised. Gold was shoved into ammunition lockers, and the entire floor of the captain's day cabin was blanketed in paper securities. A representative from the Bank of England, Alexander Craig, was on board, and there was so little room for an extra bed for him that he actually had to sleep on top of the paper money in that room for the entire voyage. On this particular voyage, which was, at the time, the biggest single movement of physical wealth in history, Emerald was escorted by two British Navy destroyers. But the convoy yet again hit turbulent storms in the North Atlantic, forcing the destroyers to turn back. HMS Emerald, however, continued, lonely with singular resolve, to her destination in Canada. Can you imagine how sweaty the arse cheeks of the captain must have been at that moment? carrying £200 million across U-boat infested waters, and his protection detail had just given up the ghost. But just like all the previous voyages, Emerald made it to Halifax on the 1st of July, intact. But with a few more holes than when she departed, and the odd broken timber. Now, if you thought that mission was impressive, it was only half of what came next. 4 days later, on the 5th of July, Operation Fish waved goodbye to its magnum opus, a fleet of 5 ships, 3 luxury cruise liners refitted for war, and 2 Royal Navy ships, HMS Revenge and HMS Bonaventura. In total, there was a jaw-dropping £450 million worth of treasure spread across the fleet, worth over £20 billion in 2025. To this day, this convoy represents the largest single movement of physical wealth in history. The convoy had to fight a thick fog for most of the journey and dodge icebergs. One of the luxury cruise liners had an engine failure in the middle of the Atlantic, but the crew got her up and running again after spending a few days repairing it, all the while bobbing around like a sitting duck just awaiting the arrival of a German U-boat. But thankfully, it never came. Despite these issues, all 5 ships made it and delivered every single crate of fish. In fact, over its few short weeks, Operation Fish saw the bulk of Britain's wealth successfully move to Canada. Not a single gold bar or a share certificate was lost, and so far as we know, the Nazis didn't discover the operation until it was declassified after the war. Part of the reason for its extreme success was its extreme secrecy. Every possible measure was taken. Most of the gold was moved around Britain to ports such as Plymouth, Liverpool and Greenock in the middle of the night, shrouded in darkness. The ships maintained strict radio silence en route. Oh, and did you notice how pretty much every Operation Fish fleet hit storms along the way? Well, that was on purpose. Sort of. The convoys sailed during forecasted adverse weather conditions and only took remote, perilous routes just for that extra level of cover. And to top it all off, the top brass behind Operation Fish decided not to inform Britain's own War Risk Insurance Office to prevent someone there from leaking the operation. And that was a British government-backed and controlled office. This meant that if a ship was sunk, there would be no insurance payout to cover the loss. When these gold convoys reached Canada, it was typical for the entire pier to be cordoned off and cleared of bystanders to prevent any spies from gathering evidence. At one point, over 100 Royal Canadian Mounted Police were seen forming a perimeter around Pier 6 in Halifax Port. Whilst cordoned off, the gold and security crates would be transferred onto a waiting train. No mention of these ships and their cargoes were ever made in the port logs. And just like back in Blighty, no Canadian port workers nor the mounted police officers were made aware of the true contents of those crates. Although they must have thought it was all a bit over the top, this level of security and secrecy for some bloody fish. The British knew that storing this gold in Canada would have been a bit tricky, since every Canadian gold vault was already chock full of wealth at this point. As mentioned, Britain and other European powers had been ferrying gold to Canada for safekeeping for a couple of years before Operation Fish. And so there would certainly be no room at the inn when the bulk of Britain's wealth turned up in 1940. Thus, before all these ships arrived, a brand new vault was created especially for Operation Fish in the basement of the Sun Life building in downtown Montreal, the headquarters of a life insurance company. 3 stories below, a construction crew hastily hammered out a new vault. To save time, they took steel beams from a nearby abandoned railway to use in its construction. The 5,000 employees of the Sun Life building had absolutely zero idea of this activity and were never informed of the vast amount of wealth being stored right below their feet. Most of the paper securities from Operation Fish were stored here, in over 900 filing cabinets inside the vault. But much of the gold on the trains continued on to Ottawa, where it was kept in the Bank of Canada's gold vault, since there was still a little bit of room in there, enough to swing a cat attached to a gold bar at least. By the end of the war, the Bank of Canada's vault had received a whopping 186,332 gold bars and 8 million ounces of gold coins, belonging to either Britain or her allies. Good old Canada never charged a cent to these nations for storing or processing their gold. By the end of the war, not a single gold bar, coin or share certificate that was transported as part of Operation Fish went missing. The Nazis never uncovered the plot, despite hundreds of members of the public being hired in secret to work in the Bank of Canada and the Sun Life Building's basements, to process the gold and securities, working tireless 12-hour shifts. And when you think about every moving part, every bit of planning, and the physical transport of the wealth of the biggest empire the world has ever seen, the fact that it wasn't leaked or discovered is actually kind of mind-blowing. At one point, however, residents of Montreal did get a little suspicious of the growing activities around the Sun Life Building, and rumours started in town. So, Operation Fish higher-ups countered this by intentionally spreading a new rumour that the crown jewels had been relocated for safekeeping below the Sun Life Building, which they hadn't. But people bought it anyway, and the diversion seemed to quell further suspicions. The public only found out the true nature of Operation Fish when it was declassified in 1946. With the benefit of hindsight, we now know that Britain was never invaded by the Nazis, and so all that money would have been safe, tucked away in London's vaults. Of course, they didn't know that then. But the fact that so much was put on the line, and such enormous risks were taken, just to ensure that Britain could keep on doggedly fighting against evil if Hitler did invade, and all seemed lost, is, if you ask me, rather amazing. Thanks for watching. A big thanks to Fishing Clash for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to download the game using my link in the description, or scan the QR code you see on the screen and use my special gift code 42 to claim a special $20 value reward, including a unique avatar for free.